Well, there's quite a few, and let me at least hit some of the top five to be considered by your audience. One of the first is in looking at issues such as communications and information management. Those two elements need to be key cornerstones of any plan that people put together. Two reasons. One of them on communications. If you can't call for help, you can't get help. You really need to be able to communicate. And on information, the information required to make critical decisions in a disaster, well, frankly, information is just as important as food, water, or shelter in a crisis, because if you can't get the right information to meet the needs of the victims, you can't supply them with what they require. So those two elements become the first component I would talk about. The second one is to break down what I call the stovepipes or silos to communication among organizations. While having organizations that are measured in a concise manner from a work standpoint or a government standpoint may make sense in our daily lives, when a disaster hits, it doesn't work because Mother Nature crosses every single one of those silos and comes back and says, if you don't share information effectively across your departments, you can't respond in an effective manner. So we've got to break through those silos. So communicate properly, break through the silos. Another issue that comes up is emergency powers provisions. A lot of government agencies and even businesses have certain policies and practices that are in place in their normal daily business. And in a disaster, we need to find ways to, not to bend the rules so much, but to put in place alternative rules or emergency powers that apply to help the victims of a disaster much more effectively. Those may be changes in customs regulations, they may be change in a tax that can be deferred for some reason, and maybe making it easier to get building permits at zero cost and automating the process. But each of those would come under a category called emergency powers provisions. The next one I would talk about is developing what are called task orders in advance. Now, what's a task order? A task order is something for a business or a government entity, again, that defines a particular procedure or process that they need to go through to respond in a disaster. It may be procuring a certain item. It may be buying telephones or services or computers or procuring pencils, whatever it is. But in the normal routine, they go through a long cycle to get these things approved and to go through the normal process. In a disaster, you don't have that kind of time. So if you can define those elements in advance and go through the approval process ahead of time and create these task orders, when a disaster actually occurs, it's then very easy to issue those at the time of the event and get a response immediately instead of waiting the 2, 3, 4 days or sometimes weeks to accomplish what you need. The last item is non-binding memorandums of understanding. Now, a memorandum of understanding is a document that's signed between two parties that allows them to more effectively share information in a crisis. Now, this could be between the public and the private sector, or within the public sector, it can be across multiple agencies. Remember I mentioned in disasters breaking down stovepipes and silos? Well, the memorandums of understanding help to document that process. And for example, after the tragic events of Hurricane Katrina, one of the challenges was trying to reunify families and get them together. Well, there were many agencies involved that had information that was key. The Red Cross, who was in a shelter, the hospitals, the morgue, unfortunately, many other agencies that were involved. Well, if memorandums of understanding to share that information had been signed in advance across these agencies, then the reunification process could potentially be accelerated. And each component could do due diligence in advance, and then when the disaster occurs, we're going to be more effective in responding to the needs of the victim. Another great example is public and private sector partnerships. If the private sector provided a non-binding memorandum of understanding where they're talking about the kinds of services and support that they might be able to provide at no cost, potentially in a disaster, donations of food or services or materials or in-kind capabilities, and that was collected in a database that was available to the public sector to help manage in a disaster, then the public and private sector could work together in a crisis and accelerate the delivery of critical services to the point of the victims in a faster, more accelerated, more efficient manner. So I'm a big fan of these memorandums of understanding and how that would work. So those are some of the top 5 elements for building resiliency within public and private companies.